It's demand driven because the government of the own country knows best, and you improve ownership of the help. So you don't go to a country and say, you do this, you do that, you do that. So it's a bit of the imperialist reflex. Let the own governments decide what they should do. If they have money, they find a way to mature and do the ways themselves. The downside is that these governments are more accountable to the donor than to their own populations. Because if they would receive money from taxes, people would hold them more accountable since it's their money. So if you just give money to governments, you could say that you're also stimulating corruption and inefficient workings. So secondly, there is the multilateral channel. Organizations like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF and the WTO. What we think, or what we always hope to think about these organizations, is that they're neutral. Since especially UN is made up of the world community, General Assembly, working. But one could also say there is not really an organization to hold the UN accountable when they mess up, since we are all making up the UN. So you can ask the question are these organizations too big to fail? Or is there a lack of a proper alternative? Or, and this is something said a lot especially in Africa, that these organizations are protecting the interest of the West. And there are some pretty good arguments to be made for this. For instance, in the Security Council, there's of course the P5, consisting of mostly Western or based on the post-Second World War paradigm powers. No South American country represented, no African country structurally represented. Problematic. And of course the World Trade Organization, the Doha rounds are still running for about 15-20 years, and there's not really a lot of improvement there, and still the EU and the US, which are giving huge amounts of money in development, are actually breaking more down with the subsidies they're giving to their own farmers, or even putting up trade barriers for countries to sell their own products. So it has to be seen in this political balance. So from budget support and multilateral organizations, we go to the private sector. Especially in the Netherlands, people say a lot, this is something that really works because it's really supply and demand. But then you have the question, do we try to work with small organizations, to the microcredit, to empower people to have their own businesses and make real capitalists of them? Or do we give it more to multinational organizations who are working there, who have much better chain control? We can say we hold them accountable, and we ask the consumers to hold them accountable, to not work with child labor, etc., etc. And then there's of course always the private sector now seems to be a good argument to work on your own nation's interests. So you support the companies that also work in the Netherlands, but based in the Netherlands or in your respective home country.
Are you talking about TNT, for example, right now? Or?
Yeah, but what is a pretty good example is the flour industry now in Kenya and also Ethiopia. A lot of producers from the Netherlands found out, man, it's getting really expensive with all these glass houses here. Let's do that in Ethiopia and Kenya, where it's good weather all time around. Low wages, land is cheap, and we can also get subsidy to our work. Great stuff. So, but then also the labor conditions are worse, and it's kind of weird that we're now in these times of global warming, and that we're paying a company that produces flowers for the Netherlands to produce them in Ethiopia and fly them here on a daily basis.
We just had somebody in our UCU in Africa course today who's actually from Afri-Flora. Like, that's really interesting. What he was saying was interesting in that respect, that he said that the CO2 footprint that his company leaves is actually lower compared to if they produced it in the Netherlands, just because, yeah, the sun is already there, so even though you produce CO2 by flying, he said overall, that's at least according to his statement, it's kind of a more sustainable or better way of producing it. So yeah. It's more environment. I don't know if that's true, but I thought it was an interesting point to to think about.
Definitely interesting, but I find the logic of producing flowers, which they good for a week somewhere else, and then flying it over here, I don't know.
Well, that they had a whole different approach of kind of developing a whole village around it. So they have a hospital, they set up a school, and kind of try to do regional development.
Okay, I don't want to get all critical about private development here, right? And we just started into the presentation. But what you see with traditional communities, how they live, and now for instance, the government of Ethiopia, which is really spearheading economic growth of Africa, is like economic growth from 7 to 12% structurally over the last 8 years. Great work. But still, it's one of the most repressive governments of Africa, and it's doling out land like it's nothing, and it was never properly registered. So original communities, yeah, they get schools, but their original way of living is completely destroyed. I'm not saying that it's good to keep a folklore country in Ethiopia or Uganda because we find it beautiful to go there as tourism. Of course, you should have the opportunity to choose for themselves, but the problem is that right now often governments or large landowners are making the decisions for the people there.
Maybe just to give some perspective, in Tanzania there's a very big flower production area, and of every one passenger flight that goes to Kilimanjaro Airport and flies back, there's 3 cargo flights from KLM with flowers. So remember, was it last in January where we had this?
When it was clogged.
When it was clogged?
Yeah.
Those companies made so much loss, it was insane, and the only discussion in Arusha that was happening was pretty much, we were making so much loss because cargo flights can't get out. For the flower industry, it was detrimental, and when I went to go buy flowers in January, they were like, oh yeah, we don't have them. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it's Holland, that's what we do. It's like, no, actually, it's all from Africa, so that's one thing to put in perspective. And with regards to communities, the same thing with coffee plantations, that these communities are pretty much, sure, they develop a community, they're developing their own labor force, pretty much. They put a school there, they put a hospital there, they put all these things there, but you don't get out of the coffee plantations. Everything is indoor. And they're actually just ensuring a next generation of labor force to work on the coffee plantation by itself.
And this is true for food. This is true for flowers. This is true for several products that there's actually a structural lack of in Africa, which we're just for here. So it doesn't necessarily make sense. Then the fourth channel that governments can use to support democracy and property, etc. That is NGOs. And this is just a small overview of Dutch NGOs funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a chaos, isn't it? So there are many different. So NGOs is not only organizations as we have. For instance, there are 2 development cooperation organizations in Germany, but they're mostly put out by, mostly guided by governmental institutions. In the Netherlands, we have a very privatized groups with very independent NGOs. But when you look at the way of funding, is that in the Netherlands, up to now, you get if you're lucky, 5 years funding. So you give once every 5 years, you come with, all the organizations have possibility to submit their plans for the coming 5 years to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they dole out money. And then our organization is for 50% dependent on that, and for the rest on other funding from the EU, from other NGOs, etc. In the US, in USAID, they're doing much more tenders. So the US government is saying we need to have, we think it's very important that 4 labor unions for journalists and 5 radio stations are set up in Tanzania, and give us your project proposal, how are you going to do it, and then you can win that bid. So that's much more project finance. Whereas the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs says, what do you think is a good idea? We have a thematic field, where do you think we should go? And why am I telling you this is that it's becoming more and more of a political influenced process.